war itself, but it continues as an essence. However, the means may be shaped and changed, and according to this, war can never be separated from political communications, and if this happens after all, everything becomes meaningless. Politics, and specifically Clausewitz calls this lineaments, remain determinative in a war. However, how does Clausewitz define these policies? In his biography of Clausewitz, Wilhelm Ritter von Schramm explained as follows. And this is quite interesting, by the way. It is therefore the politics of balance, if you will, policies of balance, of integration, of the wholeness, if you will, of the interests both of the nation-state and society as a whole, which Clausewitz refers to when he talks about politics and policies. He wants to see it preserved even when other means are used, when the conflict of interests have been resolved by military means. And the Clausewitz expert, Professor Dietmar Schössler, called it precarious that only this axiom of Clausewitz was laid down by the German army, and Moltke's review rejected. Now, by doing so, the authors basically eliminated the justified criticism of, for example, authors like Werner Hallweg. He even suggested that when it comes to the political level of Clausewitz, that it should be given priority and only to apply the findings of Moltke at the lower levels. Now, in our presentation given at the Vienna Strategiekonferenz at 2018 on immutable principles of military action in peace, crisis, and war, we formulated three intellectual guardrails, as it were, put forward by Clausewitz. Now, also, of course, they can be applied to the topic of our lecture. First of all, now, for politics to make demands regarding war that it can simply not fulfill will basically run counter to the presupposition that it knows the instrument it wants to use. In other words, it would run counter against the natural presupposition. In other words, that means that the political strategic level must not make demand on soldiers at the level of operational implementation of strategy that they cannot meet. The second guardrail, as I would like to call it, is, admittedly, the political element does not penetrate deeply into the details of the war, which is to say, one does not set up field guards and does not patrol according to political considerations. The third principle is, if a war is to correspond entirely to the intentions of policy, and if policies are to be entirely appropriate to the means of war, then, where the statesmen and the soldiers are not united in one person, only one good remedy remains, which is to make the Supreme Commander a member of the cabinet so that the latter may take part in the substantial moments of action, as it were. Good morning from my side, good afternoon rather. I would like to continue to talk about the characteristics of strategy and the demands on those responsible for it. A forward-looking strategy for the period beyond the ceasefire has not yet been developed by any side of the Ukrainian war. It would certainly have been easier if the political strategy level had developed a mutually coordinated strategy for the assistance of many states, NATO and the EU, and above all the US, regarding the purposes, as the Ukrainian side has done for its defense war, and ordered and directed its operational implementation. Now, what demands should be made on those responsible for the development of strategies and operational implementation? Now, in his book, The Russian Campaign of 1812, Clausewitz demanded of one strategist, he who wishes to move in one element as war itself is at liberty to bring nothing from the books but the education of his mind. If he brings to the table ready-made ideas, which the thrust of the moment has not provided him with, and which he has not produced from his own flesh and blood, the current of events will throw down his edifice even before it is completed. And he continues on to say, on the operational implementation of the strategy. But the main thing is the difficulty of implementation. In war, everything is simple, but a simple thing is most difficult. The instrument of war is like a machinery with tremendous friction, which cannot be reduced to just a few mechanical points, but this machine is in contact with an army of coincidences everywhere. Now, to both scientists and authors, those responsible for strategies had to be learned practitioners. Now, the theory and underlying practical action capability required, as Clausewitz says, is a guide to this person who wants to acquaint himself with war from books. It brightens his path everywhere, eases his steps, educates his judgment, and keeps him from going astray. Now, what do these demands of Clausewitz and Moltke, which will sharply emphasize the value of practical action, to those responsible for developing strategies at a political strategic level and implementing them in terms of operations? Today, more than ever, this requires the involvement of all levels of command and non-military sectors, as well as the players. In earlier conferences, we described this in great detail. Now, those responsible for developing a strategy, as well as its operational implementation, are in permanent decision-making and control processes. They cannot withdraw into an ivory tower after establishing such strategies. A strategy is not a matter of course. Constantly and, let us say, constantly supported with clear concepts. Rather, they should be ready to adapt those strategy to the development as called for by a situation in the war zone. Now, it may happen that a strategy, for example, proves insufficient, or it has to be abandoned and even redeveloped. Now, to do this, leaders should seek advice from all relevant sectors of their own country and their allies. They should press and persuade their partners and also, of course, make a compromise with them. Now, advice from, as well as dialogue with the operational level soldiers is certainly key to success. Now, those processes, are often tough, and sometimes they also lead to the result that a strategy simply cannot be implemented because sufficient forces and resources lack, and other forces as well as developments prevent this. Now, the cascading interdependency between the operational level and the level of a strategic purpose, political decision-making, is often reduced to what is feasible. Now, recognizing and orchestrating this requires knowing, or yes, practitioners with the relevant know-how, as demanded by Clausewitz and Moltke. Now, in war, only the simple succeed, as Clausewitz emphasizes. This requires unambiguous and clearly comprehensible strategies that include all responsible areas and that can be easily understood and accepted by all participants, and that can be implemented at the operational level by all troop leaders without any frictions. Now, Clausewitz demanded that with regard to the scope of responsibility, the responsibility of the political strategic level, the proportions and facets as follows. In the 6th chapter of the 8th book of his work on war, he says that it is inadmissible and harmful that if a great warlike event or the plan for such an event is to admit of a purely military judgment. Indeed, it is an absurd procedure to consult military men in war design so that they are able to judge on the purely military, as the cabinets will do. But even more absurd is the demand of theoreticians that the means available of war should be referred to by the commander. Now, Gerhard Ritter, in one of his work, pointed out that Germany's misfortune had been that the campaign plan, the strategy of 1914, had been conceived in a purely military manner, and that the available means of war had been assigned to one commander, to the commander, the head of the Supreme Army Command, without the due coordination between the need for war and the available means. Now, those responsible for strategy must also decide how intensively they should intervene in the operational implementation of their strategy in a controlling and, if necessary, corrective manner, which is to say when and how they should intervene. An example regarding the results or consequences of the non-intervention of the political strategic level in the level of operational command was dealt with by Bingener and Wellner in the newspaper FAC on the 26th of April 2022 in an article called How to Get Rid of Former Chancellor. And in this connection, they referred to a statement by the former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder in an interview with the New York Times, saying that Putin himself had apparently not given the orders for the cruel killing of defenseless civilians in Bucha near Kiev. Now, during World War II, it was more common for German war crimes and military mishaps to be apologetically uttered by frontline soldiers. If only the Führer knew, because he was thought to be infallible. If Putin, as commander-in-chief, had wanted to stop war crimes committed by his soldiers, he would have immediately brought the perpetrators to the punishment. Now, whether this happened is something we do not know, but those responsible for a strategy must personally monitor, stop and punish war crimes that are the result of inadequate training, for example, or feelings of hatred towards the enemy and the civilian population, that they are not stopped by the immediate superiors. Now, to get through to the individual soldiers, of course, requires the strategists to be quite assertive, tough, and also experienced in commanding the troops. Now, actions committed by soldiers today requires even more, to a greater extent than before, a justification. And Section 17 of the soldiers' law calls for impeccable behavior in and out of service. On the one hand, there is the demand that leaders at the operational level waiting for orders cannot use the favor of the moment. On the other hand, there is the complicated operational law that constrains and also regulates actions committed by soldiers. The fact that global terrorism activists do not respect the law of engagement is a heavy burden for today's soldiers. Now, against this background, soldiers must be educated and trained to always act in accordance with the law. They have been taught, and at all times, to want to apply this in the most difficult situations in operations and war. Now, the necessary training and supervisions of those responsible at the strategic level and their immediate superiors at the operational level was obviously not provided for Russian soldiers in Ukraine, unless these war crimes were deliberate. Now, the training goal, education to hatred, was fundamentally anchored in the years of the Warsaw Pact. For example, it was embedded in the field service regulations of the armed forces of the USSR from 1962 and also in the combat regulations of the land forces of the NVA from 1983. Now, the tasks of political work under combat conditions are to educate the soldiers to feel a burning hatred against the enemy. That is specifically the role laid down in the service regulations of the Soviet army. Now, in the corresponding NVA service regulation, the development of hatred for the enemy as a task of political work in preparation for and during combat. Now, do we still have that let us say, Putin's armed forces are still taught in that manner? Now, if so, it has certainly motivated war crimes in Ukraine. What would have been the consequences in terms of a ceasefire and also the period afterwards with the goal of creating peace? And another question should be asked, which is to say, what use is the best theoretical training of those responsible in strategic thinking by studying as well as learning the elements of a strategy if the methods of the practical implementation have not been taught, mastered, and practiced during their training, and also if they do not have any practical relevance. Certainly there is a risk that the conduct, let us say, as referred to as the wrinkles by Clausewitz, that successful action at the operational level would have been omitted. Now, it's difficult to recognize the horizons of strategies and strategic necessities. Now, the strategic goal for supporting Ukraine in the war against Putin, we want to see Russia weaken to a degree that makes it impossible for the country to do what it did to Ukraine with the invasion. Now, this ignores the main requirement for a strategy, namely to create a peace through it, as demanded by Clausewitz. According to Clausewitz, armed forces are only the means to achieve victory, victory are only a means to achieve the ultimate ends of strategy, peace. Now, to identify this goal, to implement it, and also to make soldiers, or to equip soldiers with this principle is certainly the most difficult responsibility for a strategy. Now, in his Altersschrift zum ewigen Frieden of 1795, Immanuel Kant, in the 6th preliminary article, this is the prohibitive articles to the actions of a state, put up the following requirement. No state in war with another should permit itself such hostilities which must make mutual confidence in future peace impossible, which is to say, for some level of confidence in the enemy's way of thinking must still remain in the midst of war, because otherwise no peace would be concluded and hostility would turn into a war of extinction. Now, in view of the abhorrent war crimes committed by soldiers of the Russian army against the civil population in Ukraine, this message is difficult to convey. Nevertheless, in our opinion, it must always be kept in mind. Now, Clausewitz was taught, as well as Kant's logical method, by the philosopher Johann Gottfried Kiesewetter. They were to shape his later major work, Vom Kriege on War. Now, the attempts of the heads of state and government to seek dialogue with Putin again and again, despite the horrors of war, fulfill Kant's and Clausewitz's call for ways to peace beyond a ceasefire. Now, this is a challenge that must be tackled now and is not a generational project, as assumed by Mützenich. And the political strategic level must, through supervision and action at the operational level, force the troop to behave in such a manner that does not block Kant's demand. And this shows how close the connection is between the cascading relationship between strategy and operational implement, and there is really no separating these two. Now, they are always interconnected in various degrees of intensity.
Now, let us summarize. We have worked out that there's always a multifaceted and cascading interrelationship of effects between the political and strategic level, which is responsible for developing a strategy and a strategic purpose, for example, in the case of aid to Ukraine and its defensive war, and its operational implementation at the levels of military strategy and tactics, which can only be managed and orchestrated by knowledgeable practitioners from among those responsible for strategies.
Der nur von wissenden Praktikern und Praktikerinnen aus dem Kreis der für die Strategie Verantwortlichen bewältigt sowie orchestriert werden kann.
They decide to what extent and with what intensity they have to intervene in the operational level in order to correct deficiencies there, to maybe punish war crimes, and to make compromises in order to be able to realize a strategy that takes the respective situation into account and its implementation down to the lowest soldier. Strategies are developed in dialogue with the operational implementation level, in close cooperation with the commanders of the subordinate areas and the many actors of the own state, as well as in dialogue with the allies. They are a system of improvisations, of auxiliary means that enable the ability to act under pressure of the most difficult situations. Strategies must go beyond a ceasefire and point to ways in which peace can be achieved after the end of a conflict. Those responsible for a strategy and its operational implementation must not obstruct this goal by tolerating the criminal actions of their soldiers. A remainder of trust in the humanitarian attitude of the enemy, in which Kant and Clausewitz believed, must never be destroyed. In the implementation phase of a strategy, politics retains its first rank and always has multiple tasks aimed at supporting the operational implementation level and, of course, at peace. The plethora of ways of assistance provided to Ukraine by many alliances and states requires a strategy of all parties involved, as well as clear, unambiguous terms in order to avoid a Babylonian confusion of languages between the stakeholders as well as in the media, and to reduce frictions. These are currently not present among politicians, the media, and some of the self-proclaimed experts. And finally, let me add, Clausewitz, Moltke and their axioms provide the intellectual tools and insights into a fundamental analysis of the cascading effect relationship of a strategy and its operational implementation for the practical requirements for strategists and their manifold fields of action in their implementation, under the primacy of politics, as well as intellectual guardrails or guidelines for their safe action. They contribute to reducing these wrinkles in the minds of those acting, which can lead to irreparable mistakes as well as to wrong decisions. And with that, we would like to thank you for your attention and would also like to thank the organizers that we were able to hold the keynote speech at this year's conference once again. Thank you so much, General. Thank you, Magister KRUEGER. Ladies and gentlemen, now you have the floor. You have the ability to ask questions, any questions that you might have. If you could please raise your hand if you would like to ask a question, and I will come to you with the microphone. General, I would like to thank you for your remarks. I think this was a very clear and very concise lecture. Also, thank you to Ms. KRUEGER. My question is, what do you do if you don't have a strategic objective prescribed to you? And we've seen examples in the past, in 1914, for example, when the Austro-Hungarian Empire entered the war without any strategic goal, the American war in Iran without a strategic objective, the war in 1991 that also was without any strategic goal. So what do you do in such a case? And the second question is more practical. You talked about leadership and the leadership of troops. And what do you mean by that? Thank you. General, let me summarize once again. What can we do without a strategic objective? Well, if there are no prescribed strategic objectives, and that is one of the major questions, and we tried to illustrate it as follows, there is always the way to have a developmental strategic goal, sort of a grassroots goal from the bottom up. A similar scenario is what we're witnessing in Ukraine at the moment. Of course, it's always favorable to develop strategic goals at first and then develop ways of implementation at the operational level. This is not something that we're seeing in Ukraine at the moment. We also try to illustrate that the two rudimentary goals that the Americans had, the Minister of Defense and the Foreign Secretary, and what was, released in the newspaper, all those were not finished, completed strategies. However, we do think that all leaders have to make an effort to define these strategic goals, because otherwise there will be no direction at all. And the other thing that we try to illustrate is that, there's a lot of babbling about a ceasefire and about, laying down weapons. But I think that the purpose of any war must always be to achieve peace, and that's why we quoted Immanuel Kant. Let me also add something to that. Well, there is a quote saying that, whenever you forge a path, you have to walk on it. So you might not always have an objective or a goal that you're trying to reach, but it will always be necessary to make little steps and to forge these paths, to make an effort to create a path towards something. And according to which steps you take, you must react. So this ability to adapt, to adjust to a situation, that can only exist if you have this strategic approach. Only then will you have the ability to adapt to the conditions, the situations. You might also have to adapt to changing goals and objectives. On the other hand, troop leadership to me and leading troops to me means it is what I, as a leader, must be prepared to do, and that is what I can expect of my soldiers. So I can never expect more of them than I would be willing to do. And this is a huge challenge. Leadership in itself means so many things, and I'm sure, General Peiner, that you know all about this. There's some of the things that you must know and bring to the table as a leader are prescribed, but it's always dependent on the personality of a leader, how they actually implement those tasks. Since we're running a bit late, I'm going to allow one more question and any remaining questions you might ask during the coffee break. I think we are not really listening to each other when we are asking questions and answering here, because I think the question is, which strategy does Ukraine pursue in the war against Russia? This is a simple question. How would you define Ukraine's strategy in this war, General? Well, I think it's very clear, and President Zelensky has been repeating this. The strategy is to defend Ukraine and to win back the lost territories, and he will do anything it takes. He keeps saying that they will go all the way to victory. He and Macron both chose this term victory, this Clausewitzian term. Let me also add, though, that Ukraine is also dependent on what the Western countries can offer Ukraine. And this will determine the way they can design their own strategy. So I think it is a kind of representative war. There's the Western forces, the nuclear forces such as the US and China, who are leading these strategic questions, who have the most say in these questions. So I think there's many different options that might lead to a ceasefire, but these are all discussions that are being held in secret, where we are, not at those tables, where we are not able to listen and know all the facts. But one last thing, on a strategic level, to actually agree on something, that's always guided by how both parties are forced to do it, and nobody really wants that at the moment, because we've talked about the clash of this taboo, and that's why I think that it will take more time and there will be more bloodshed in the future until a solution is found. Thank you so much, Ms. KRUEGER and General. I know this is an extremely interesting topic that we probably could be discussing much longer, but we'll try to stick to the agenda, and I would like to ask Brigadier Peischl to start the next lecture. Let me just add one thing, though. We've been cooperating for many years, and it's never been as difficult as this year to prepare a lecture as it is now. We have never had such heated discussions. It's really surprising, actually. It's actually not surprising at all that we would have to find a compromise. And I think we've really overcome Corona here that my colleague was suffering from, and we have accelerated her healing process with this wonderful discussion. Thank you so much.